Hey there. Tonight we are going back to a time before Egypt had kings, before stone crowns, before towering temples, when a few people standing near the Nile looked up into a white-hot sky and saw a falcon hanging there so still that it seemed less like a bird and more like a thought from the heavens. What they saw in that patient shape was not only beauty, it was judgment, distance, power, and a kind of calm that can make the heart beat a little slower even while the world below remains wild. In that high silence lay the beginning of Horus, and the darker truth resting beneath his bright wings is that he would become not only a god of the sky, but a witness to murder, inheritance, and the long struggle to put a broken world back into order. If you enjoy these slow journeys into old myths and ancient shadows, leave a like, subscribe, and settle in with me tonight. Lower the lights a little. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench. Breathe in slowly, and let the day drift farther from you, because this story begins not with a throne, but with a bird above the river. Long before scribes pressed signs into wet clay, long before priests measured out incense in temple light, the Nile Valley was a place of reeds, mud, heat, and small human settlements tucked close to the water like cautious thoughts. The river moved through the land with the quiet assurance of something older than memory. In the distance there were low desert ridges, pale and patient. Near the banks there was life in layers. Fish turning under silver ripples, insects singing in the tall grass, hunters stepping carefully through the mud with spears balanced in tired hands. Over all of it, sometimes barely moving, a falcon. I have always found it a little strange that some of the greatest gods begin with something so simple. A glance upward, a held breath, a creature doing exactly what it has always done. Yet perhaps that is how reverence often starts. Not with argument, not with doctrine, just with the small human shock of noticing. The falcon did not flap noisily like a marsh bird. It did not scatter itself in panic. It watched. It circled. It chose its moment. Then it fell from the sky with a speed so sudden that it almost seemed the air itself had turned into a blade. To the people living beside the Nile in those very early days, the falcon must have seemed impossible. It saw what no person could see. It ruled heights no person could reach. It struck with a precision that made ordinary hunger look almost sacred. One can imagine a child pointing upward with mud still drying on his ankle, a mother shielding her eyes, an old hunter narrowing his gaze and murmuring that such a creature surely belonged to more than earth. In a world where survival depended on reading signs correctly, the falcon was a sign that read everything first. Archaeology gives us only fragments from that far horizon of time. A broken pot with a bird scratched into its surface. A carved line on stone where a sharp beak curves forward. A painted shape on pottery from the Gurzian period, crude by later standards, but not crude in feeling. Even the roughest image carries intention. Someone made time for that bird. Someone placed it among symbols worth keeping. Someone, perhaps without knowing it, was helping the god we call Horus move closer to a name. Those early communities were not one people in the way we think of a kingdom. They were clusters of villages, local loyalties, rival groups, little worlds along the river, each with its own habits and fears and protective powers. Yet the falcon moved above all boundaries. It flew over fishing camps and burial grounds, over reed huts and dry grave pits, over places where one tribe traded and another fought. Because it belonged to the sky, it was never easy to trap inside one small story. That is part of why Horus grew so large. He was always available to be shared. In one settlement, a falcon spirit may have guarded hunters. In another, it may have watched over a local chief. Somewhere farther south, a community may have whispered that the sky itself was a giant bird whose breast held the stars and whose eyes lit the world. None of these ideas canceled the others. They drifted together, slowly, like silt coming down river. A feathered guardian here, a celestial watcher there, a royal emblem somewhere else. The Nile did what the Nile always did. It connected. Among the strongest early centers of falcon devotion stood Hierakonpolis. The city later associated so deeply with the bird of the sky that even its identity seemed wrapped around wings. It was a place of ritual and rising power. Priests there did not invent Horus all at once. Gods are rarely assembled like furniture. What they did, more quietly and more effectively, was gather stories. They took scattered reverence and gave it shape. They organized symbols. They repeated names. They placed offerings before falcon images and treated the bird not merely as a sign of divine force, but as that force focused. If you were standing there with me, in the hot air near one of those early shrines, you would not yet see the polished theology of later Egypt. You would see dust on feet, linen rough against skin, smoke from simple offerings curling upward, and a bird image receiving food as if it truly were alive. The sacred often begins with rehearsal. A bowl set down, a name spoken twice, a gesture repeated until repetition becomes truth. Trade helped. Conflict helped too, in its own unpleasant way. Villages exchanged goods, spouses, grudges, songs. Symbols traveled with them. A local falcon spirit from one district met another from the next district over. Their stories overlapped. Their functions began to resemble each other. Priests, chiefs, and ambitious rulers noticed that a shared divine language could do something powerful. It could persuade different people that they belonged, if not to one blood, then at least to one sky. And that mattered more and more as power gathered in human hands. Egypt, even before it became Egypt in the full royal sense, was moving toward concentration. Some leaders were learning that to rule widely, you needed more than strong arms and stored grain. You needed legitimacy that felt older than your own ambition. A god who looked only after one little town was useful. A god who could watch from horizon to horizon was better. A falcon soaring over every border was ideal. So Horus rose with politics, though not in the cheap way that makes religion feel merely invented. It was more intimate than that. Human communities were becoming larger and more entangled. They needed a symbol that could be both fierce and distant, near and universal. The falcon answered that need with unnerving grace. It was already royal before anyone crowned it. It already understood elevation. It already lived above the quarrels of the ground, while still being able to descend at any moment and settle the matter. The earliest rulers of the Nile Valley must have loved that image. One can almost feel the attraction of it. To stand before uncertain subjects and imply, gently or not so gently, that your authority had the same sharp gaze as the bird above. To suggest that you did not merely govern a patch of mud and reeds, but carried the sanction of the open sky. This was not just decoration. It was political weather. A falcon standard lifted in the sun could turn force into destiny. Still, Horus was never only political. That would make him too small. There was always something grander in him, something cold and beautiful that belonged to the upper air itself. While other gods might arise from marsh, field, childbirth, flood, or tomb, Horus increasingly belonged to height. The heavens were not empty above Egypt. They were feathered. They were watchful. They bent over the world like outstretched wings. Ancient Egyptians would later imagine the sky as the body of a vast falcon. And that image feels so right that it almost seems waiting inside the earliest layers of the cult. Look upward on a clear night in the desert, away from cooking fires, away from human noise, and the stars do not feel random. They feel placed. They feel embedded. One can understand how a people living beneath that dome came to imagine it as plumage, as a breast scattered with points of light, as a living thing larger than fear. The sky was not a ceiling. It was a God-keeping position. The beauty of this old religious growth is that it was patient. Horus did not arrive in one polished myth. He gathered himself over generations. He absorbed local spirits. He borrowed from hunter memory, royal desire, and priestly reflection. He became a god by remaining larger than any single explanation. One village knew him through a perched bird near a shrine. Another through a banner in battle. Another through a whispered idea that the heavens had eyes. All of them were correct enough to keep going. Honestly, that may be one reason Horus endured so long. He could mean many things without becoming vague. He was specific in image. A falcon, bright eye, hooked beak, still wings. Yet immense in implication. He was not only speed, but watchfulness. Not only violence, but timing. Not only kingship, but the condition that makes kingship imaginable at all. He looked before he struck. He ruled before he landed. By the time Egypt moved closer to political unification, the falcon god had become almost unavoidable. In a land where power was consolidating and symbolism mattered as much as grain storage, Horus offered something precious. He offered an image of authority that felt natural, cosmic, and slightly frightening. A ruler could present himself as beloved of Horus, protected by Horus, shaped by Horus, or eventually as Horus embodied. That was not just useful theology. That was a way of binding earth to sky. Yet for all this grandeur, the beginnings remain tender to imagine. A few people by a river, light on water, a bird moving across the morning. The first reverence is rarely loud. It is more often a hush, a pause in labor, a lifted face, a feeling that someone or something is seeing farther than you can. And when enough generations feel that same hush, a god takes form. So Horus first enters the long memory of Egypt, not as avenger, not yet as child hidden in reeds, not yet as the wounded claimant before a divine court, but as altitude itself, as the clean line of authority drawn across the open sky, as vision sharpened beyond the human limit, as a force that could gather tribes, steady rulers, and make a kingdom dream upward before it ever learned how much grief would one day gather beneath those wings. For once, Horus belongs to the heavens. Everything changes. A bird can be admired. A sky god can be feared. But a sky god whose eyes become the sun and moon begins to rule not only space, but time, day, night, warmth, darkness, and send the quiet rhythm by which a civilization learns to measure itself. You know that feeling when a place becomes larger in memory than it was in life. A childhood room becomes a kingdom. A single road becomes the edge of the world. Something similar happened here, only on the scale of religion. The falcon that once crossed a local patch of sky became the mind through which people understood the sky itself. A shrine became a horizon. A bird became a principle. The principle was simple enough to feel in the body. True power does not rush. It does not chatter. It waits. It sees. And when it acts, it does not miss. In the evenings, when the sun lowered itself into a haze of red and gold beyond the west, I imagine the earliest worshippers looking up and feeling that the day was not merely ending, but being watched to its proper close. Then night would come softly over the floodplain, and another kind of seeing would begin. The stars would appear in patient numbers over black water and sleeping reeds, and the same God who ruled the blazing height of noon would remain present in the cooler silence. That is where Horus starts to become more than a hunter in the sky. He becomes continuity itself, the one who sees in both brightness and dimness, the one who does not disappear when the light goes out. It is important to linger here a little longer, because later myths can make Horus feel already finished, already dressed in polished gold, already standing beside thrones and funerary rites and legal disputes among gods. But before all that, there is this slow accumulation of feeling. Clay in the hand, dust on the ankle, reed shadows crossing water. A village learning to think of the heavens as alive. This is the deep root. Without it, none of the later splendor would matter. Without it, Horus would simply be another story. With it, he becomes inevitable. And soon, from this immense and feathered sky, the Egyptians will begin to imagine the god in even greater detail. If the heavens are his body, then what are those two burning lights that govern every day and every night? If he watches from above, how exactly does he watch? If he is kingly, what kind of gaze does kingship require? Those questions float upward naturally, and once they are asked, Horus opens his eyes. The old priests, who stood beneath painted ceilings and watched dawn spill over the eastern edge of Egypt, understood something that is very easy to miss if we hurry past it. A sky god is already impressive. A falcon god is already beautiful. But a falcon god whose eyes are the lights by which the world keeps time becomes something far more intimate. He does not merely rule above you. He enters your mornings, your harvests, your tides of sleep, your counting of months, your fear of eclipse, your comfort at moonrise. Horus was not only in the sky, he was the way the sky looked back. The right eye came first in splendor, bright, fierce, almost too direct to bear. It blazed with the force of the sun crossing the heavens each day, pouring warmth over stone, field, reed, and human face. In the Egyptian imagination, this was not passive illumination. The solar eye did not simply shine because that is what suns do. It shone because Horus willed sight into the world. Its heat ripened grain, dried mud brick, woke fishermen before dawn, and turned temple gold into a kind of disciplined fire. Yet the same radiance could also punish. Too much of it, and the ground cracked. Too much of it, and mercy seemed far away. That is what made it divine. It could nourish and burn in the same glance. The left eye belonged to another mood entirely. Cooler, quieter, but in some ways even stranger. If the right eye commanded the day with open authority, the left eye governed the night through patience. It was the moon, silver and remote, soft enough to calm water and sharp enough to mark the passing of time. Under its light, travelers found paths. Priests counted cycles. Women tracked the secret arithmetic of bodies and seasons. And sleepers felt the world remain held even in darkness. The lunar eye did not announce itself with force. It revealed by restraint. It made edges gentler, distances uncertain, and silence more meaningful. I have always loved that the Egyptians did not leave these two lights as abstract symbols floating somewhere beside the god. They made them active, alive, nearly independent. The eyes of Horus could move with purpose. They could leave him. They could act. They could seek, protect, punish, restore. That is one of the most elegant things in all Egyptian myth. Vision itself becomes a creature of will, not sight as a passive condition, but sight as an extension of divine intention. You can feel how much this mattered in a landscape like Egypt. The Nile Valley was a place where light was never trivial. Morning light meant labor. Midday light meant endurance. Evening light meant relief. Moonlight meant movement through danger with some hope of orientation. To imagine the sun and moon as the eyes of a falcon god was to say that existence itself was being supervised. Someone saw the river when it flooded correctly. Someone saw the fields when they failed. Someone saw a king on his platform and a peasant crouched over irrigation channels. Someone saw jackals on the edge of the cemetery and boats moving toward distant reeds at dawn. The world was not unwitnessed. This double vision also made Horus richer than simpler sky deities. He was not only heat, he was also coolness. Not only proclamation, but observation. Not only the striking dive of the predator, but the long, still gaze before the strike. That balance would matter later, when myths asked him to become both avenger and judge, both warrior and rightful king. But even here, in the older celestial imagination, the groundwork had already been laid. A god with two different lights in his head is a god already capable of complexity. When Egyptian religion became more formal and more layered, this primal sky falcon came to be known in one especially ancient form as Horus the Elder, Horus the Great, Horus to later tongues. This was not yet the hidden child in the reeds, not yet the son who would fight his uncle, not yet the wounded eye restored by wisdom and magic. This older Horus was broader, colder, more elemental. He belonged to the structure of the cosmos itself. If the later Horus feels like a prince moving through tragedy, Horus the Elder feels like weather, astronomy, and kingship braided together until they become one divine presence. Artists struggled, and beautifully so, to give form to something so large. Sometimes they showed him as a full falcon, alert and magnificent, feathers laid with such clean intent that each line seems to carry wind in it. Sometimes they gave him a human body and a falcon head crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. That image would become one of the great visual statements of Egyptian civilization, because it unites what the people most feared and admired: animal precision and royal command, instinct and order, talon and crown, sky and throne. In some temples, the priests described his body as star-marked, the heavens themselves laid across his chest. It is a lovely thought, almost tender, despite its grandeur. The night sky is not a separate thing. It is plumage. The stars are not random points. They are part of the god's skin. When you lie beneath them, you are lying beneath Horus. When the constellations wheel slowly from season to season, they are not simply moving. They are participating in his endless poise. And because Egypt was Egypt, this cosmic beauty did not stay separate from rulership for very long. That is one of the great patterns of Egyptian thought. The world above and the kingdom below reflect each other. A king who rules properly should resemble the sky in reliability, rhythm, and protective span. A ruler who sees poorly endangers everyone. A ruler who cannot strike when needed invites chaos. The falcon, therefore, became more than admired wildlife and more than celestial metaphor. It became a manual for kingship. Think of the actual bird for a moment. It circles high, often almost invisible against the brightness. Then suddenly it tilts, commits, and descends. No wasted movement. No theatrical uncertainty. The prey below does not get a speech. It gets impact. To early Egyptians, that behavior must have looked exactly like justice imagined from above. The powerful see what the weak do not. They wait until the proper moment. Then they act decisively. That is how a king should protect the land. That is how a god should answer disorder. The falcon did not merely symbolize power. It provided its choreography. Royal hunts captured this logic in ceremonial form. Kings and nobles who associated themselves with Horus did not hunt only for food or sport. The act itself, with bird overhead and attendants below, became a living demonstration of divine affinity. To watch a trained falcon launch from a gloved arm into clear air, then return with its purpose completed, was to witness an earthly echo of the celestial order. A ruler who could master that bird implied that he too stood in measured relationship to the god of the upper world. Sacred falcons, therefore, received forms of care that ordinary animals never knew. Temple enclosures built for them were not simple cages. They were houses of presence. Perches were placed where sunlight arrived correctly. Water was kept clean. Priests and handlers observed the birds with close attention, not only to keep them healthy, but to read them. A restless bird might indicate disturbance. A calm bird might suggest divine favor. Even the practical details of feeding and training acquired liturgical color. Small gestures repeated carefully beside a holy creature become ritual very quickly. If you were walking through one of those temple spaces in the early morning, you might hear the small sounds first. Sand under sandals. A bronze vessel set down gently on stone. Wings shifting once, then settling. Incense, not yet fully lit. Then light begins to enter the enclosure and the bird's eye catches it. And for a heartbeat, that eye does not feel animal at all. It feels like a shard of something older, sharper, less forgiving. One can see how a priest might bow without thinking. The more Egypt organized itself into a kingdom, the more useful and sacred this visual language became. A single god whose sight stretched over both upper and lower lands could justify a single ruler over both lands. The double crown placed upon a falcon-headed form was therefore not a decorative flourish. It was a theological argument. It said that the same power that held the sky together could also hold the country together. Fragmented loyalties, local identities, village gods, all of them could remain. But above them there would now be a greater altitude, a greater gaze, a greater sanction. There is something almost humorous in how effective images can be. Give human beings a bird with excellent posture, and suddenly entire political systems begin arranging themselves around it. But that humor only works because the image is true at the level of feeling. Horus fit the aspiration of Egypt. He was elevated without becoming abstract, remote without becoming absent, fierce without becoming mindless. He could be loved, feared, and used to legitimize rule all at once. The priests did not reduce him to one meaning. They let his identity breathe. In one hymn, he might be celebrated as the great sky ruler whose right eye is the sun and whose left eye is the moon. In another, he appears closer to earthly authority, protecting crowns, sanctifying banners, giving kings the courage to stand against enemies. In yet another, he becomes the hidden power inside clear sight itself. The certainty that what is righteous can still be seen even when the world is dim. That flexibility is part of what made Horus endure across so many centuries. He could adapt to the needs of different eras without losing his core. A local village could still feel that he watched over their piece of riverbank. A royal court could claim that he stood behind national sovereignty. A cosmological text could cast him as one of the great structural powers of the universe. The same god held all three roles with remarkable ease. Feathers are light. Myths, when well made, are lighter still. They settle where they are needed. By now, the falcon god had become inseparable from the Egyptian imagination of vision itself. And vision, in Egypt, was never only physical. To see was to know, to govern, to bless, to attack, to remember. A blind or dimmed eye implied more than weakness. It implied disorder. An eye restored implied more than recovery. It implied that balance had returned. That symbolic field would later deepen into some of the most famous stories in Egyptian myth. But even at this early stage, the idea is already present. Horus sees. Therefore, the world is held in relation to itself. The right eye, with its solar blaze, also linked Horus to later theological developments involving the sun god Ra. Even before formal fusion traditions emerged, one can sense the attraction. How could a god whose eye was the sun remain forever separate from the great solar sovereign? Over time, Egyptian thought, being generous and layered rather than neat, would allow these divine identities to approach, overlap, and in some cases combine. Yet Horus never vanished into mere solar abstraction. The falcon remained. The beak remained. The hunting calm remained. Even when he rose towards supreme solar significance, he still carried the old altitude of the bird. The left eye, meanwhile, remained a treasury of possibility. Moonlight encourages stories of recovery, hiddenness, and return. It waxes, fades, and comes again. No wonder later myth would attach wound and restoration to Horus through that lunar aspect. The moon is a natural teacher of loss that is not final. Something can diminish and still return. Something can be broken and still shine later in another shape. You can feel the later drama already waiting inside that image, even before the narrative of Set, Osiris, and Isis begins to tighten around it. For now, though, Horus the Elder remains immense and somewhat aloof. More sky than family, more structure than story. His worship carries the grandeur of open space. His gaze gives Egypt a language for power before tragedy gives that power a face. Beneath his wings, the kingdom can imagine itself not merely defended, but supervised by a force whose sight is total and whose authority feels older than any human dynasty. And still, the myth is preparing to narrow. That often happens in ancient religion. A god begins huge, then becomes local through narrative, then becomes huge again through theology. Horus starts as sky. Soon he will enter a household. Soon brother will turn against brother. Soon a chest will close. A river will carry death. And a hidden child will inherit not peace, but a wound in the middle of creation. When that happens, the god of distant altitude will become personal in a new way. Before we leave this older celestial Horus behind, it is worth standing one more time beneath his imagined body. Night above the Nile. Stars fixed like bright dust in dark feathers. The moon lifting quietly from the horizon. One eye opening. Dawn yet to come, but promised. In the hush before morning, a person in ancient Egypt might have felt very small and very protected at once. That is not a bad definition of religion. To be dwarfed by what watches you, and comforted by the fact that it does. Soon the god will descend into grief, family violence, and kingship claimed through suffering. But he begins up here, remote and radiant, teaching Egypt its first great lesson about rule. A ruler must see far. A ruler must contain opposites. A ruler must know when to burn and when to cool, when to strike and when to wait. The heavens themselves had offered the image. Egypt merely learned how to keep telling it. And as the story moves downward from sky to throne, from celestial stillness to divine betrayal, the great falcon keeps both eyes on the world. One bright with day, one silver with night, both waiting for the moment when vision alone will no longer be enough. The peace of the early divine court did not last. It rarely does in stories that survive for thousands of years, because people tend to remember the moment when a family table goes quiet more vividly than the long seasons when everyone behaved themselves. In the realm of the gods, Osiris sat upon the throne with a composure that made rule seem almost effortless. Grain ripened under his gaze. Law settled where his words landed. The air itself seemed less quarrelsome when he passed through a hall. Egypt below mirrored that calm. Fields answered the river. People sowed, harvested, built, and buried with a sense that the world, though difficult, was arranged correctly. Beside him stood Isis, and it is impossible to tell the story well without pausing for her. She was not merely the loving wife in a sad old tale. She was intelligence with a pulse. She was patience sharpened into magic. She knew names that opened sealed things. She knew the hidden joints in reality, where one force could be turned into another. If Osiris made rule feel stable, Isis made it possible for that stability to survive contact with danger. Together they formed something almost unbearable to behold. Authority with wisdom, fertility with protection, ceremony with actual power. You can see why the court admired them. You can also see why one figure in that court could not bear them for long. Set watched. He watched from the edge of order, the way a desert wind watches a field of barley, with impatience and a kind of insulted hunger. Where Osiris was green life, Set was red land. Where Osiris gave instructions that became harvest, Set embodied the jagged interruption, the hot gust, the stinging sand, the thing that did not ask permission before tearing through a boundary. That does not make him simple, and the old Egyptians were too intelligent to make him simple. Chaos has its uses. Storms clear the air. Deserts guard borders. Harshness can harden a kingdom that softness might weaken. But Set did not want to be useful within order. He wanted to replace order. At first, his resentment may have looked almost reasonable from a distance. That is how bitterness often begins. A younger brother glancing too often at an older one praised by everyone. A powerful being, growing tired of hearing that his force is necessary only when properly controlled by someone calmer, kinder, more beloved. Each success of Osiris deepened the trouble. Each festival in the king's honor, each grateful prayer rising from the Nile Valley, each satisfied murmur from the gods. Set stood near enough to see the admiration, and far enough away to feel excluded from it. I have always found it deeply human that divine jealousy in Egyptian myth does not begin with philosophy. It begins with a glance across a room. Someone else has what you wanted. Someone else wears ease more naturally than you do. Someone else is loved in a way that makes your own powers feel misread, unwanted, or merely feared. Set, for all his frightening grandeur, enters this tragedy through that old and miserable door. His nature fed the feeling. A being tied to storm and barren land will not hold envy in a gentle shape. It scraped and hardened inside him until admiration became contempt, and contempt found itself looking for an occasion. He did not challenge Osiris directly. That matters. Open combat has rules. Open combat might even allow dignity. Set chose something colder. He chose a plan that relied on trust. The feast he arranged would have looked magnificent, One can imagine the hall prepared with obsessive care, oil lamps shining against polished surfaces, cups already waiting, servants moving in soft rhythm, the smell of roasted offerings mixing with sweet wine and incense. Music probably floated along the walls with that strange ancient confidence that music always has, as if it has never once doubted its right to exist. The assembled gods relaxed into celebration. It was presented as honor, a gesture of brotherhood, a recognition of Osiris and all he had achieved. The trap, like many traps, wore good manners. At the center of the hall stood the chest. It was extraordinary, not merely expensive, but exact. A container made with a sort of craftsmanship that invites desire before it invites suspicion. Fine wood, precious metals, gemstones that caught flame light and held it, smooth surfaces under the hand, proportions that suggested hidden perfection. Set had commissioned it with measurements taken in secret, shaped precisely to the body of his brother. A masterpiece built not for gift-giving, but for enclosure. I suppose that is one of the grimmest details in the whole story. Beauty serving murder with impeccable discipline. The game began lightly. Whoever fit perfectly inside the chest would win it. Harmless amusement after food and drink. One by one, the gods tried. Too short, too broad, too long in the leg, too narrow at the shoulder. Laughter may have risen, genuine or forced. The mood in the room would have been strange if anyone had noticed it carefully. A little too curated, a little too eager. But Osiris, in all versions of this moment, remains trusting. He approaches. He lowers himself into the chest. And of course it fits. Perfectly. Then the lid falls. What happens next always strikes me not only for its cruelty, but for its speed. The conspirators do not hesitate. They know their parts. The lid slams shut. Fastenings bite. Seals are fixed. In some tellings, molten lead is poured into the seams. In others, nails or magical bindings make the closure final. However one imagines the detail, the feeling is the same. A room that held celebration turns in one breath into an execution chamber. Osiris, king of the gods, is trapped not on a battlefield, but in a box built to flatter him. The horror of the scene lies partly in how close everyone is. This is not distant violence in a desert pass. It is intimate. Guests in attendance, the smell of wine still in the air, music perhaps still trembling from the last note. Set's triumph begins not with a sword, but with the sealed helplessness of someone who trusted the room. When the chest is carried away and thrown into the Nile, the insult becomes cosmic. The river that nourished Egypt receives the bound king like a funerary burden it never asked to bear. The chest drifts, down the Nile first, then outward, carried by current and fate together. I like to imagine that the water around it moved differently, as if even the river understood that something unnatural had entered its care. The banks pass by. Mud villages, reed beds, distant fields under late light. The chest glides beyond all ordinary jurisdiction, and while it moves away, something in the structure of the world begins to sag. A rightful king has been taken from his place. Nature notices. Meanwhile, Isis understands absence before anyone tells her the whole truth. Love often does. She searches, asks, feels the pattern wrongness spreading around her. Then the reality arrives, and grief takes form. In some traditions, her mourning affects the natural world immediately. Tears swell into flood. Wind changes. Crops falter. Even if we read those details as poetic theology rather than literal weather, they are emotionally exact. When the center of her life is removed through treachery, the world ceases to feel correctly joined. Isis does not surrender to sorrow. This is the first of many ways in which she saves the story from ending too early. Grief moves through her, yes, but it does not stop her hands. She traces signs. She follows rumor. She works divination like a woman threading a needle in low light. Slowly, steadily, without wasting motion. If Osiris's murder is the story's first great rupture, Isis' search is its first act of repair. Her path leads beyond Egypt to Byblos, where the chest has come to rest against a tamarisk tree near the shore. Here the myth becomes dreamlike in the way only old myths can manage. The tree grows around the chest, enclosing it within living wood, holding death inside growth. By the time human eyes notice the marvel, the trunk is already thick and beautiful enough to attract a king's attention. It is cut down and taken as a palace pillar. So, Osiris, sealed in crafted wood, becomes hidden inside living wood, and then made into architecture. A dead god becomes part of a royal house in a foreign land. It sounds impossible, which is one reason it feels true at the mythic level. Great grief often makes the world feel arranged by symbols instead of logic. When Isis arrives there, she does not storm the palace. She enters with intelligence. Sometimes a god wins by thunder. Isis wins by reading rooms. She reveals enough of herself, enough of her force, enough of her sacred purpose, that the local ruler yields the pillar. It is given to her, and she draws the chest out from its wooden concealment. There is tenderness in this image that never quite leaves me. Her hands on the wood, the long journey ending in a quiet recovery, the shape of her husband found again at last, though not living. She opens the chest. Inside lies Osiris, preserved yet gone, not ruined by decay, which would almost be simpler, but present enough to break the heart more carefully. He looks like himself. That is the difficulty. Death is often cruelest when the face remains familiar. The goddess grieves, and still she continues. It is one of her defining qualities. Every time despair would be understandable, Isis chooses task. She brings the body back to Egypt and hides it in the marshes, planning what no one else could plan. Restoration. That plan fails, or rather is interrupted by further cruelty. Set learns that the body has been recovered. He understands the danger immediately. A corpse preserved by a goddess is not a finished problem. So he acts again. This time there is less elegance. He seizes Osiris's body and dismembers it, scattering the pieces across Egypt. Not merely murder now, but fragmentation. Not only death, but the attempt to make mourning impossible by giving grief too many locations, 14 pieces in many versions. A country turned into a map of loss. The effect on the cosmos is severe. How could it not be? The king who embodied right arrangement is no longer even whole. The Nile hesitates. Time stumbles. Animals act strangely. The boundaries between healthy growth and decay become uncertain. I do not think the myth asks us to imagine this as spectacle. It asks for something quieter and worse. A universe that can still function externally while its inner pattern has been slashed apart. Then begins one of the most patient acts in all mythology. Isis goes searching again. She takes the form of a kite in some tellings, a bird gliding over river and field, scanning, circling, descending. It is a marvelous image. A goddess who once searched by divination now searches by flight. Above marsh and canal, shrine and shore, she moves with tireless intention. One by one, she finds the scattered remains. A hand here, a limb there, a piece hidden where crocodiles sleep, a fragment guarded by hostile forces. Each recovery is both practical and sacred. Gather, cleanse, preserve, continue. The missing part, the one the fish have consumed, forces her to improvise. I mention this gently because the story itself treats it not as vulgarity, but as theological necessity. Isis fashions a replacement with clay and magic, making from absence a means toward continuation. That detail tells you nearly everything about her. She cannot restore the past exactly as it was, so she creates what is needed for the future to begin. That is not only sorcery, it is wisdom in the shape of mourning. When at last the body is reassembled in secret among the reeds, Isis performs the greatest working of her life. The marshes around her must have seemed impossibly still. Night insects, water sounds, mud cooling after heat, starlight caught in black channels, a hidden place where the world has narrowed to body, breath, words, and will. She speaks the old spells. She binds fragment to fragment. She calls to the soul of Osiris. For a moment, only a moment, death yields. Osiris returns. Not fully, not permanently, not in the simple way grief would prefer. But he returns enough. Enough to see. Enough to know. Enough to love her once more. Enough for conception. This is one of the most profound moments in Egyptian religion, and also one of the saddest. They do not get ordinary restoration. They do not recover the life they lost. They receive an interval, sacred and brief, in which continuity can be created. From death interrupted, a future enters the world. Horus is conceived there, in secrecy, in sorrow, in defiance of annihilation. He is not born of festival abundance. He is not the easy child of a secure household. He begins as a final answer to treachery. He carries within him his father's broken kingship and his mother's impossible persistence. It is no wonder later Egyptians saw in him not merely royalty, but legitimacy fought for through suffering. Osiris cannot remain. The resurrection fades. His role changes. He moves toward the realm of the dead, not as a failed king, but as lord of another kind of order. This, too, is part of Egyptian genius. The murdered ruler does not vanish. He descends into underworld sovereignty. Death itself is reorganized around him. But for Isis, left in the marshes, pregnant and hunted, theology is less immediate than danger. Set still rules. The child she carries is a threat to that stolen rule. Therefore, the child must be hidden. And so the story that began with sky and moved through courtly treachery narrows now to reeds, mud, insects, and a mother alone. Egypt, immensa as it is, will soon become for Isis a hidden island drifting in papyrus shade. The cosmic struggle will enter infancy. The falcon will be born small, and the god who once seemed to belong entirely to the open heavens will learn first to survive close to the water. Under cover, where every sound in the marsh might mean that Set has come again. That is where we must go next. Into the reeds, where the child of resurrection begins to breathe, and where protection becomes as sacred as kingship itself. The marshes of the Delta were the right place for a hidden god to begin, because marshes have always understood the art of concealment. They are generous and secretive at the same time. Water glints openly, but depth hides beneath it. Reeds move in the wind and tell you nothing. Birds rise, settle, and make whole countries of sound out of very little warning. Mud holds tracks until it does not. If you wish to disappear without truly leaving the world, you could do worse than drift into papyrus country and trust the green walls to keep your breathing private. There, Isis made her refuge. Some traditions imagine it as a floating island, and I think that image suits the mood perfectly. Not a fortress of stone, because stone announces itself. Not a palace, because palaces belong to visibility. A moving patch of hidden ground instead. Half reed bed, half miracle, held together by roots, silt, woven stems, and spells murmured over water in the dark. The sanctuary did not simply sit in one place and hope not to be found. It shifted. It listened. It responded. Thick papyrus stalks stood around it so densely that daylight broke into narrow green shafts before it reached the center. Channels opened and closed with the moods of current and wind. The island itself could seem solid one moment and indistinct the next, as if indecision had been turned into architecture. That was necessary, because Set had already begun to search. The birth of Horus did not pass unnoticed in the hidden levels of existence. A new divine presence, especially one born from murdered kingship and defiant resurrection, disturbs the atmosphere of myth like thunder, far off over flat land. Set felt it, perhaps not as information at first, but as pressure, as interruption, as the unpleasant certainty that something he had tried to finish had not, in fact, ended. So he sent out servants, scouts, things loyal to storm and waste and violent appetite. Some had animal heads and human cunning. Some moved like marsh creatures until you looked into their eyes too long. Some were only rumors that wore flesh when needed. Isis understood this and layered protection as carefully as a weaver building cloth. One spell bent sound away from the island. Another muddled scent. Another caused intruders to drift in circles until they believed they had reached open water, when in fact They had only described a patient loop around the sanctuary 3 times. Certain reeds were charmed to stiffen when danger approached, so that a soft wall could become suddenly hard as spears. Birds that nested nearby were taught, in the old magical way that lies somewhere between command and friendship, to rise all at once if hostile magic came within range. And then there were the 7 scorpions. I admit I am fond of them. It is impossible not to be. In a myth full of gods, kings, mutilation, magical architecture, and cosmic lawsuits, 7 determined scorpions somehow remain among the most memorable presences, perhaps because they bring the scale of danger down to something immediate. A child sleeps. A mother keeps watch. Around them, in the mud and along the roots and stones, small armed loyalties hold their ground. These were no ordinary creatures. Each had a name, a role, a temperament. They served Isis with a dedication so complete that one feels their loyalty almost as warmth. Some scouted. Some guarded. Some stung first and considered the consequences second. Their bodies, dark and polished, carried venom potent enough to humble beings much larger than themselves. Their silence was one of their greatest gifts. A serpent may hiss. A dog may bark. A scorpion only arrives. And by the time you understand its opinion of you, the lesson has already begun. Horus, as an infant, would have been dangerous even if he had not been hunted. Divine children seldom behave with the considerate modesty required by secrecy. The child was bright with power from the beginning. His eyes carried unusual fire. His cries traveled strangely. His tiny hands gripped with far too much strength. In a safer household, such things would have been taken as blessings and discussed proudly over lamplight. In the marsh, they were security problems. Imagine poor Isis trying to hush a baby whose voice already carries a suggestion of falcon cry through the reeds. There is something almost comical in that, though the comedy is edged with exhaustion. She, greatest magician of the gods, must still do the ordinary labor of motherhood. Rock the child. Feed the child. Soothe the child when the world is too large and his body too full of strange force. Even divinity, it turns out, does not excuse anyone from being very tired in the middle of the night. She learned quickly. Silence spells were woven around sleeping places. Protective signs were drawn in mud beneath the cradle. Certain lullabies carried hidden magical structures that calmed not only the child, but the radiant disturbances his emotions sent into the air. The island itself was trained to help. When Horus became agitated, the reeds bent inward to thicken concealment. When he laughed too brightly, the wind shifted to carry the sound elsewhere. When danger neared, even the frogs seemed to lower their voices. Still, danger did near. Set's servants scoured the delta in widening patterns. Crocodile-headed scouts slipped through channels with only their eyes above water. Serpentine beings threaded between root systems. Shape-shifting agents posed as harmless birds, fishermen, fragments of driftwood, and occasionally, one suspects, bureaucrats of the divine realm. A search grows desperate after a while, and desperation makes imagination industrious. That was true for Set as much as for Isis. One night when Horus was still very small, perhaps only months old, a pack of dreadful jackal-like hunters entered the region around the sanctuary. They were not simple beasts, but things altered by divine service. Their noses could sort through the smells of marsh rot, fish oil, wet linen, lotus, and human fear, separating what belonged from what had been hidden unnaturally. Their eyes could notice where magic lay over the world like a second skin. Their patience was wolfish, but colder. Isis could not meet them by simple force. Not yet. To engage openly might expose the child. So she did what the wise do when strength is the wrong answer. She turned movement itself into deception. False trails were laid with her own magical signature. Pockets of scented reeds were enchanted to suggest divine milk, fresh linen, and the breath of an infant. Water channels were coaxed into new shapes overnight, so that trackers following one clue would arrive at an island that had already ceased to be where it was the evening before. The Scorpions supported this campaign with a seriousness that would be admirable in generals and delightful in creatures no larger than a hand. One lurked on a half-submerged branch directly where a pursuing beast would place its paw. Another rested motionless beneath a mat of reeds until a muzzle came too near. Their ambushes were quick and unsentimental. The marsh itself joined in, because there is no reason nature should remain neutral when one of its own hidden children is in peril. Mud clutched ankles. Water plants thickened under hostile bodies. Insects rose in clouds to blind eyes at the worst possible moment. On one of these nights, a single hunter nearly found the sanctuary. He had outthought the false trails, or perhaps simply grown suspicious in the correct direction. The creature moved before dawn, that uncertain hour when concealment weakens and every hidden thing fears definition. He came close enough that Horus stirred in sleep. That detail matters. The child knew danger before language. His body recognized threat with a truth older than teaching. His small hands tightened. His eyes began to glow beneath closed lids. The eldest scorpion met the intruder first. I imagine the scene in little flashes. Wet bark. A still dark body on a log. The hunter lowering its head to inspect what appears unimportant. Then the strike. Precise. Merciless. Venom like a final answer. The beast convulses, but the other guardians have already raised a field of muffled sound, trapping its death inside a pocket of silence. Not every victory in myth needs trumpets. Some are won by not being overheard. These repeated searches changed the life of the marsh. Entire sections of reed bed were burned by Set's agents in frustration. Waterways were poisoned. Marsh creatures fled and returned in patterns of distress. Hidden communities of ordinary people living nearby. Fishers, reed cutters, gatherers of bird eggs, would have felt the unease, even if they did not know its cause. Strange lights at night. Channels that no longer opened where memory said they should. Silence where birds normally rose. A place can know it has become part of a war without ever hearing the names of those fighting. Horus grew in that atmosphere. He did not grow like a mortal child, though not so wildly as to become unrecognizable to one. There remained enough ordinary development to make the story feel maternal. He learned balance, movement, voice, attention, but everything accelerated. He lifted his head too early. He watched with too much concentration. He gripped toys until they cracked. He could sit in stillness that felt almost priestly, then suddenly explode into motion so fast that even Isis had to laugh despite herself. A god is still a child if he puts a sacred object in his mouth. I think this is where the myth becomes especially lovely. The future avenger of Osiris is first a boy being taught not to reveal himself every time he is angry. Great destinies often begin with practical correction. No, not so loud. No, do not blaze at that. Yes, that is a crocodile, but we are not wrestling it today. There is tenderness in imagining Isis, supreme mistress of magic, having to negotiate with a divine toddler who has inherited just enough dramatic instinct from his family to be difficult. Yet she taught him seriously too. Her role was never only protective. She was preparing him. The first lessons were lessons of concealment. How to look without announcing that you are looking. How to feel movement through water. How to distinguish the honest sound of reeds from the sound made when something larger than wind presses through them. How to quiet the body enough that another creature reveals itself by impatience. The marsh was not merely hiding place. It was school. Every insect hum, every fish ripple, every bird cry became text. Magic came next, though perhaps not in the grand gestures people now expect when they hear the word. Real magical education in old stories often begins with names, patterns, correspondences. Isis taught him how one thing leans toward another. Which herbs cool heat? Which sounds calm venom? Which lunar phases sharpen protection? Which star positions strengthen a prayer for concealment? The lessons would have unfolded with extraordinary patience. A bowl of water, moonlight on the surface, a word spoken 3 times. A child asked to repeat it until the water responds. Horus learned quickly. Of course he did. He was the son of the most formidable magician in Egypt and the heir to a divine crisis. The mind inside him was bright. But brightness in youth is not the same as mastery. He could call force before he understood cost. He could detect patterns before he understood timing. So Isis trained not only his abilities, but his judgment. That may be the true inheritance she gives him. Not raw power, but disciplined power. The scorpions contributed too, in their own manner. A surprising number of excellent life lessons can be taught by creatures who survive mainly through restraint and one perfect act of commitment. From them, Horus learned stillness, positioning, the usefulness of appearing smaller than the threat believes you to be, the importance of striking only when the strike matters. Honestly, one could build an entire political philosophy from attentive scorpion observation, though it might not make for cheerful dinner conversation. As Horus moved from toddlerhood toward boyhood, his body began to display the signs that would later define him. His gaze sharpened into something that made even older beings pause. He could follow the movement of a dragonfly over water without seeming to move his own eyes. He could hear disturbances too slight for others to notice. When he ran through the marsh paths, he did so with a strange blend of grace and suddenness, as if speed had been thinking about him for a long time and was relieved finally to have a form to wear. Set, meanwhile, did not stop searching entirely. But his methods changed. Direct pursuit had brought embarrassment and losses, so he turned to attrition. Agents lingered farther from the sanctuary, waiting for mistakes. Informants listened among human communities for stories of an unusually radiant child or a hidden woman whose presence seemed to alter weather and fertility. Some versions of the broader myth remember poisonous creatures being sent against Horus during childhood. Serpents and venomous things meant to end the problem quietly. This too fits the mood of the marsh years. Threat arriving not as army, but as intrusion. Death slipping where it should not. Isis countered with more than force. She built alliances. Marsh spirits joined her side. Those old local beings that belonged to place more than to pantheon. Crocodiles patrolled outer channels. Protective birds nested nearby. Water itself learned to answer her hand. The hidden sanctuary became not just a refuge, but a small ecology of resistance. Set ruled from visible power. Isis survived through relationships. There is a lesson in that. One ancient Egypt understood well. Order is not held only by crowns. It is held by networks of loyalty. Years passed this way, though myth measures them more by transformation than by number. The child lengthened. The roundness of infancy left him. His face took on that impossible mixture of youth and command that certain statues capture so well. He learned to hold small weapons, first as ceremonial objects, then as tools. He practiced with reed spears in quiet channels. He learned where to place his feet in mud so that suction did not betray him. He learned from birds, from water, from his mother, from danger itself. By then he also knew the outline of his father's story. I doubt Isis told it all at once. No loving mother pours the whole bitterness of a murdered inheritance into a small child in one evening. It would have come in layers. Your father ruled well. Your uncle took what was not his. Your father was broken, but not erased. You were born because loss did not have the last word. There is a burden in such knowledge. Horus must have felt it gradually settle inside him, not yet as revenge, but as direction. A person can grow up in hiding without understanding why. A god cannot. His destiny was not merely to survive. It was to emerge. There is a moment in many childhoods when play begins to look suspiciously like preparation. A stick becomes a staff. A chase becomes footwork. Curiosity about boundaries becomes tactical intelligence. Horus crossed into that moment while still young. He no longer asked only what lived in the marsh. He asked what lay beyond it. What did Set look like now? How large was the court of the gods? Who remembered Osiris properly? Who had remained loyal? What must a king know that a hidden boy does not? If you were standing there with me on one of those dusky evenings, the air cooling at last over black water, you might see him at the edge of the reeds, looking outward. Not a child exactly. Not yet the full avenger. Something in between. The moon reflected in the channel. Insects circling lazily. A scorpion motionless on a stone nearby, as if guarding even his thoughts. Behind him, the soft domestic center of the island, where Isis still kept watch. Before him, a world stolen by his uncle. That is the ache of these marsh years. Safety and destiny pulling in opposite directions. Stay hidden and live. Emerge and risk everything. But myths of rightful order do not permit permanent concealment. They allow preparation. Yes, they allow childhood, teaching, stealth, alliance, healing. Then they call the air into the open. Soon Horus will leave the sanctuary that preserved him. Soon he will stand before the divine court, not as a rumor or an omen, but as a claimant. Soon words, law, combat, injury, and judgment will gather around him. But before all that, remember him here, learning to breathe softly among papyrus walls, learning to watch before striking, learning from a mother who had refused defeat twice already. The boy in the marsh is not a pause in the myth. He is the making of the king. And when at last he steps out from the green hush into the vast light of challenge, he will carry with him everything the reeds taught him. Passions, precision, silence, survival, the knowledge that rightful rule is not inherited by blood alone, but earned through endurance. So the hidden island drifts. The scorpions keep their stations. Isis teaches by moonlight and by dawn, and Horus grows tall enough at last for the open sky to begin recognizing its own image in him. The years of hiding had fallen away from Horus like old reeds stripped by river wind. He did not arrive at the assembly of the gods as a frightened child from the marsh, but as a young power tempered by silence, by hunger, by training, by memory. The sacred precinct stood before him in terrible beauty. Massive pylons rose from the earth as if the stone itself had remembered how to pray. The polished floors reflected torchlight in long, trembling ribbons. The air smelled of warm resin, lotus oil, old papyrus, and the faint mineral scent that comes before a storm. Every footstep carried. Every breath seemed to wait for permission. If you were standing there with me, I think the first thing you would notice would be the hush. Not ordinary silence. Something deeper. The kind of stillness that arrives when everyone in a room knows a family wound is about to be opened in public and no one can stop it. Horus moved through that stillness with the controlled grace of a falcon gliding over open water. Gold caught the firelight at his collar. The double crown was not yet his by judgment, but the claim of it already hovered around him. On either side of the great hall, the gods had gathered in ranks that looked orderly from a distance and deeply anxious from up close. Some faces were stern. Some turned away. Some gleamed with curiosity. A few wore that uncomfortable look of guests who had accepted invitations to a feast and discovered it was truly a funeral. At the center sat Ra in radiance that no lamp could imitate. Nearby waited Thoth with his writing tools and his patient eyes. Neath sat with the stillness of a drawn bow. Ptah, ancient and unreadable, seemed to listen to things older than speech. Other deities filled the hall with powers of river, sky, law, desert, storm, memory. Overhead, the painted constellations on the ceiling seemed to pulse as if the hall itself had become a small copy of heaven. Set arrived late. Of course he did. Men of order enter when called. Men of chaos enter when it will make the room notice. The great doors slammed outward, and heat rolled in with him. He strode forward with the confidence of one who had long mistaken possession for legitimacy. His strange head tilted slightly, sharp ears cutting the air, his skin shifting under the torchlight from dark bronze to the ruddy tone of desert cliffs at sunset. He wore power, heavily and proudly, like a man draped in stolen fabric who has decided to behave as though theft itself were a form of tailoring. When he saw Horus, he smiled. It was not a kind smile, not even an angry one. It was the smile of a being who had spent years telling himself that the child would never reach manhood. The formal challenge was read aloud. Osiris had been slain by deceit. The throne had been seized. Cosmic order had been broken. Horus, son of Isis and Osiris, demanded judgment and restoration. The words rolled through the hall like stones dropped into dark water. Each charge struck deep. Each fact carried memory behind it. The smell of river mud, of sealed wood, of morning oils, of hidden marshes, of years spent waiting. Set answered with his usual gift for turning poison into polished speech. He did not deny what he had done. That would have been too simple. Instead, he draped his violence in necessity. Osiris had been too gentle, he said. Too slow. Too trusting. Egypt required strength, not softness. The throne needed a ruler who could master storm and desert, not merely bless harvest and speak of fairness. It was, honestly, the oldest trick in power. First, make cruelty sound practical, then ask everyone to admire your realism. Several gods shifted at that. Some because they hated him, some because part of them feared he was not entirely wrong. That is what makes dangerous rulers dangerous. They rarely lie in pure form. They mix one grain of truth into a cart of dust. When Horus spoke, his voice was calmer than Set expected. That alone unsettled the hall. Young claimants are supposed to burn too fast. They are supposed to confuse fury with authority. Horus did not. He bowed to the judges, then lifted his face and answered not with a shout, but with precision. Even if Osiris had failed, he said, divine law allowed challenge. Witnesses, contest, judgment. There had been means. Set had chosen none of them. He had chosen trickery, the box measured to a brother, the sealed lid, the river, the mutilation of the dead. No ruler who begins with hidden nails and molten lead can speak with clean lips about necessary force. The hall tightened around those words. Then came the first trial. Strength. Not strength as men boast of it in courtyards, but divine strength measured against a cosmic burden. The judges called for the pillar of heaven, a vast stone support so ancient it seemed less carved than condensed from first creation. Its surface glimmered softly, covered in signs no mortal hand could have read. It stood in a courtyard open to the sky, and even from a distance, it carried the weight of myth and geology together. Dust settled around its base in rings, as though the earth itself had learned caution there. Set went first. He rolled his shoulders once, flexed his fingers, and planted his feet with theatrical confidence. When he gripped the pillar, the stone hissed beneath the heat of his hands. Muscles hardened across his back. Veins rose like cords. Slowly, with enormous effort, he lifted it. The sky above seemed to groan. Wind tore through the courtyard. Light wavered. The pillar rose to his shoulders, and for a moment it looked as though brute force alone might carry the day. Then his balance shifted. The weight rebelled. His knees bent. Rage flashed across his face. He forced the pillar one breath higher, then lost control and let it thunder back into place. The impact shook the temple. Somewhere in the mortal world, perhaps a shepherd on a distant bank looked up and wondered why the birds had suddenly taken wing. Horus stepped forward only after the dust had settled. He did not seize the pillar at once. Instead, he circled it slowly, one hand lightly touching the stone as if listening through his fingertips. I have always found it strange that wisdom so often looks unimpressive in the first moment. It does not stomp. It does not snarl. It just notices where the weight truly lives. Horus studied the balance points, the old fractures, the hidden way the mass rested into the earth. Then he placed his hands. When he lifted, there was less spectacle, more control. The pillar rose with a steadier motion. The sky did not sag. Wind did not shriek. He brought it above his head and held it there, not like a beast dragging prey, but like a ruler bearing responsibility without complaint. He lowered it so gently that the dust at its base barely stirred. That won him the first murmur of true approval. The second trial concerned judgment. Thoth laid out a dispute between two mortal communities, both dependent on the same channel of Nile water, both facing loss if the other prevailed. Set proposed division, surveillance, enforced alternation, threat balanced against threat. It was practical in the way a locked room is practical during winter. No one freezes outside because no one can leave. Horus proposed shared oversight, negotiated stewardship, mutual responsibility overseen by those not invested in either side. Harder, slower, less dramatic, and far more durable. Some of the judges frowned. Some nodded. Leadership, the hall was beginning to understand, is not merely the ability to strike. It is the ability to leave behind something that does not rot the moment you turn your back. Still, words and examples were not enough. Too much blood stood between them. The judges called for combat. A hush spread again, this time edged with excitement and dread. The gods opened a way into a sky realm where divine violence could unfold without cracking the ground beneath human feet. Horus and Set crossed that threshold under a vault of impossible color. The air there was alive with currents of magic, flowing like luminous rivers through the open blue. Beneath them lay a floor of condensed cloud, white and silver and treacherously soft, while around them wind walls marked the bounds of the contest. Set changed first. His shape dissolved and reared upward into a monstrous falcon form, copper-feathered, brutal, wrong in subtle ways, as though the desert had tried to design a bird after hearing only a cruel description. His wings beat with thunder. His talons dripped corrosive light. His eyes looked in too many directions at once. Horus rose into falcon shape as well, but his form was clean, balanced, severe in the way stars are severe. Gold and silver feathered his wings, One eye burned solar fire. The other held lunar calm. He moved with the contained certainty of something born for the sky and trained by necessity to survive in it. They struck. The first passes were fast enough to blur the sight of lesser gods. They cut through the magical currents, banking, rising, folding, turning. Set attacked with overwhelming force, diving like a hurled spear, tail lashing, claws reaching to tear. Horus met him with angles, timing, redirection. The air boomed around them. Feathers spun loose and glittered as they fell. Wind broke into screaming eddies. At times they vanished into cloud and reappeared a heartbeat later in a burst of light. Set fought like a storm that wanted witnesses. Horus fought like a hunter that wanted victory. Blood was drawn, divine blood, bright and terrible, streaked the air and vanished into the cloud floor below. Set scored Horus across the breast. Horus raked open the scaled flesh beneath Set's shoulder. Their cries echoed beyond the arena, old sounds from older species. The judges watched without blinking. Then Set unleashed a sound attack, a roar shaped from beast and thunder and desert emptiness, so violent that the sky itself seemed to recoil. Horus staggered in flight. One wing dipped. His left eye, the cooler eye, the lunar eye, took the force of that terrible vibration. Light flickered there. Silver dimmed. He corrected, but not cleanly, and Set saw it at once. Like all bullies, he smelled injury faster than honor. He drove in harder, forcing the fight downward. Horus met him, and for a moment the two great falcons collided breast to breast, claw to claw, their locked forms spinning toward the cloud floor like a falling sun and moon tangled together at the end of the world. They struck with a sound that shook the ring of watching gods. Set transformed on impact. One moment, a monstrous falcon. The next, a vast hippopotamus, armored in copper scales, all-crushing bulk and furious weight. Horus answered by becoming a crocodile of divine size, long and coiled and patient, all jaw and leverage and hidden force. Their new forms slammed across the cloud, ground in sprays of vapor. Set bit and charged. Horus twisted and locked. Their bodies crashed through the white floor, rose again, struck, rolled, tore, held. I should not say it was elegant. It was not. It was ancient. Two truths of Egypt fighting in shapes the riverbanks knew very well. Set lunged to crush. Horus slid aside and closed his jaws on the thick curve of his uncle neck. Set answered by catching Horus along the side and biting with enough force to crack scales and spirit together. Both locked down. Neither yielded. The struggle became a terrible stillness, each waiting for the other to weaken first. Ra ended it before either could destroy what remained. The separation took several gods and careful force. When Horus resumed his divine form, the damage to his lunar eye could no longer be hidden. The left side of his face looked dimmer somehow. The eye itself had gone dull, its silver clouded, its light irregular. The hall felt the injury not merely as flesh hurt, but as imbalance. A sun with no moon beside it. A ruler with one side of heaven gone quiet. Set saw it and stood a little straighter, blood running from his own wounds, confidence returning to him in ugly little increments. Horus, though breathing hard, did not lower his head. The trial had not crowned a victor. Not yet. But the sky had seen enough to know the child of the marsh was no child any longer. And as the gods withdrew from the combat field back toward the halls of judgment, carrying with them the smell of charged air, divine blood, and scorched cloud, Isis looked upon her wounded son and understood that the next battle would not begin with weapons, but with a broken eye that might alter the fate of every test still to come. They brought Horus from the combat field in a hush more frightening than any cry. The young god still stood under his own strength, but only just, and the lunar eye on the left side of his face had gone strangely quiet. Not closed, not destroyed in any simple way. Quiet, like a lamp still shaped as a lamp after the oil has failed. The silver there no longer answered the hall firelight properly. It swallowed brightness instead of returning it. If you were standing there with me, you would feel the mood turn at once. Combat can excite a crowd. Damage to cosmic balance empties it. Thoth examined the wound first. His ibis face lowered close, his fingers moving through layers of flesh, light, symbol, and law, because a divine injury is never only one thing. He looked not merely at the eye itself, but at the pathways behind it, the channels by which moon power flowed into perception, timing, protection, and all the cool forms of knowledge that belong to night. After a long silence, he stepped back and said what no one wanted to hear. The eye had not simply been bruised. Its hidden cords had been torn. Set, who had been leaning against a pillar with the lazy look of a man pretending not to enjoy another person's difficulty, failed to hide his satisfaction. He tilted his head and said something about the price of challenging established rule. Isis asked to approach. The judges allowed it. The moment she reached her son, the room changed. Not because she wailed or made a spectacle. She did not. Her grief had long ago passed beyond performance. She looked at the dimmed eye, and every mother in any age would have known that look. It carried memory of swaddling cloth, marsh water, fever nights, danger, waiting, teaching, protecting. It carried also the iron knowledge that pity alone is useless. She told the tribunal the wound must be treated at once, not merely for Horus, but for balance itself. The eye was bound to lunar order. Leave it broken, and more would fail than one god's sight. Tides of ritual, cycles of renewal, measures of time, quiet protections laid over sleeping children. The judges conferred, and even those doubtful of giving advantage to one claimant could not ignore the larger threat. Ra agreed. The trials would pause. Healing came first. A chamber deep within the sacred precinct was prepared. Not a hall of applause, but a room of work. Silver plates lined the walls. Bowls of still water sat beneath openings in the roof where moonlight could later descend. The floor was washed with natron and fragrant herbs. Cedar smoke curled in slow blue threads. The smell was cool, mineral, medicinal, almost like rain on pale stone. Horus lay upon a low platform carved from a block of dark polished basalt. He was still in pain, though he spoke little of it. That was always one of his more dangerous qualities, the way he could make suffering look almost ceremonial. Isis stood at his head. Thoth stood at his left. Seshat entered to measure alignments. Even Nephthys lingered in the doorway with a face difficult to read. Somewhere beyond the chamber, temple bells rang softly as the rest of the divine court waited. The treatment required the gathering of moonlight not as mere illumination, but as substance. Thoth set a crystal lens over the open roof. It had been ground to impossible precision, so fine that it seemed less crafted than persuaded into shape. When night deepened and the moon reached the proper height, the lens caught her light and drew it downward into a narrow silver column that fell directly across Horus' wounded eye. Isis began the first part of the working. She spoke old words, older than kingship, older perhaps than architecture. Words that did not command so much as remind reality how it had once behaved before panic and ambition made such a mess of things. The room cooled. The water in the bowls trembled. The silver plates on the walls glowed faintly, reflecting not the chamber, but distant marshes, wide skies, drifting reeds, and nights when Horus had slept safely in hiding. Thoth worked with the delicacy of a scribe restoring a damaged manuscript whose loss would wound all future generations. He traced signs in the air. He mapped the hidden fractures. He counted the broken channels. He measured loss in fractions, then in smaller fractions still. Later, ages would remember this in symbol. The eye divided, named, restored in parts until wholeness could be imagined again. What fascinated him most was that the damage did not spread evenly. Some functions were gone. Some had gone dim. Some had retreated like frightened animals. Perception of night distance. Reading of magical residue. The calm judgment that comes when heat leaves thought. All of it had been shaken loose. Isis removed what could not be saved. Not flesh. Not in the mortal sense, but the ruined pathways that no longer carried light honestly. Each time she drew one out, it shivered like a silver thread pulled from deep water, then dissolved into sparks over the basalt floor. Horus endured it without movement except for the tightening of one hand. Once, only once, a breath escaped him, sharply enough that even Set, waiting beyond the chamber with the other gods, fell silent. Then came the weaving. I have always liked that image, even though it sounds too gentle for what it truly was. Weaving suggests comfort, a shawl, a basket, some pleasant old craft under afternoon shade. This was not that. This was surgery by moon and memory. Isis took the focused silver light and guided it with her bare hands, drawing out thin, luminous strands that curved and quivered like living threads. Thoth named where each must go. Seshat measured length and proportion. Nephthys kept the boundary steady, so no wandering influence could corrupt the work. Thread by thread, the lost roads behind the eye were rebuilt. The scent in the room changed as the working deepened. Cedar gave way to something sharper, like cold metal and wet stone. The bowls of water reflected not the ceiling now, but stars. Horus' breathing slowed into an unnatural steadiness. The silver column brightened. At moments, the chamber seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the patient, the healers, and the moon. Hours passed, perhaps more. Divine time during great workings does not move politely. At one stage, the effort nearly failed. The reconstructed pathways reached toward their celestial source and found only emptiness. The old connection had been too thoroughly severed. The moonlight in the lens wavered. One of the bowls cracked. The flame in the brazier nearest the door turned green and thin. Isis closed her eyes and changed the spell. Instead of trying to restore exactly what had been, she shaped something new, a living answer rather than a perfect copy. That is the hard wisdom grief sometimes teaches. You do not always get the lost thing back. Sometimes, you must create a form in which life can continue carrying the scar. When the connection finally took, the chamber flooded with silver fire. Horus arched once from the platform, not in pain, but in sheer force of returning power. The left eye opened fully. At first it was white, too bright to look at directly. Then the brilliance settled into a deep, lucid silver, unlike its former light. Cooler, sharper, stranger. It did not merely see, it perceived. The walls of the chamber became transparent to it. Horus could sense the magical signatures of everyone waiting beyond. He could feel the traces of Set in the stone itself, like heat left in a seat after someone angry has arisen. Thoth stared, then laughed softly in amazement. The new eye was not a simple restoration. It was an alteration, an improvement in some directions, a sacrifice in others. The old lunar gentleness was changed. In its place stood a more exact knowing, an eye that could read deception, to trace intent, and calculate hidden relationships with unnerving speed. By dawn, the tribunal reconvened. Word of the healing had already traveled through the precinct, because nothing moves faster than news that a wound intended to weaken someone has instead remade them. Horus entered with bandages removed and his gaze level. Set saw the restored eye, and for the first time since these proceedings had begun, his confidence shifted from arrogance to irritation. It is a very human thing, really. The look of someone who hates unexpected competence in another person. The next challenge was to be a contest of rule rather than simple violence. A race upon sacred waters. A test of command, timing, adaptability, and nerve. Each claimant would captain a vessel through dangerous channels while gods and spirits watched. On its face, the event seemed practical, almost refreshing after all the blood and law. But of course nothing between Horus and Set remained simple. Set chose a boat built for intimidation. Broad, heavy, plated with metal, the prow shaped like a snarling beast. Horus chose a vessel narrower and cleaner in line, a craft built for balance and speed. The crews assigned to each reflected their leaders. Set gathered those who admired force. Horus drew those who trusted discipline. The race began beneath a sky the color of burnished pearl. Water slapped softly at the banks. Reeds leaned in wind that smelled of river mud and lotus. For a few moments, if you ignored the spectators and the divine politics and the possibility of treachery, it might have looked almost peaceful. Then the currents changed. Set had no intention of accepting a fair test. He drove his vessel toward hidden channels, trying to force Horus onto shallows and snagging reeds. Twice he attempted magical interference. Once he sent a wave not born of wind, but of anger. Once he stirred creatures from the riverbed to panic the opposing crew. Horus answered each challenge with calm adjustments. He redistributed weight, changed angle, redirected fear into motion. His restored eye read the currents beneath the surface before they broke above it. What looked like intuition to the crowd was in truth a new form of sight. When Set tried to ram him near a bend where the channel narrowed between black rocks, Horus made the smallest shift in steering and let the heavier vessel commit its own mistake. Set struck stone, scraped hard, and lost precious distance while shouting at his crew as if noise were a repair method. Horus passed him in clean silence. That should have ended it. It did not. Set abandoned the rules and transformed in full view of the watchers, plunging into the river as a vast red beast. Water exploded upward. Oars snapped. Divine spectators rose to their feet. Horus leaped from his own vessel and met him in the current. What followed was not as long as their sky battle, but in some ways more frightening, because river combat always feels intimate. Splashes, breath, sudden disappearance. The sound of bodies striking beneath the surface where no one can see clearly. Horus vanished once, twice. Set surfaced roaring. Then Horus rose behind him and drove him toward the shallows with relentless force. Not wild, not theatrical, just final in intention. The river itself seemed to favor the younger god. Set stumbled in the mud. Horus stood over him with water streaming from his limbs and both eyes bright, one like day, one like sharpened night. The judges ended the contest there. Back in the hall, the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. Set could still argue. He could still posture. He could still invoke strength and necessity and old grievances. But the room had watched too much. It had seen who used power like a club and who used it like a measured tool. It had seen who broke law when convenient and who returned to law even after being wounded by it. The difference matters. It always matters. Deliberations continued, and they were not light. The older gods weighed precedent, bloodline, fitness, cosmic need, and the long consequences of either choice. While they argued, Horus waited. He stood near one of the great columns with his mother, not far away. They did not speak often. They did not need to. Everything between them had already been said in marsh nights, in lessons, in wounds, in the long labor of staying alive long enough to be judged. At last the hall was called to stillness. The scales of Ma'at were set forth. Truth was invoked. Each judge cast weight not of stone, but of principle. The light in the chamber steadied. Even the torches seemed to stand straighter. And though the final pronouncement had not yet been spoken, every being present could feel history bending toward it. Horus did not smile. Set did not bow. The old wound of the family still lay open. But the current had changed, and everyone in that hall knew the next words would not simply decide a throne. They would decide what kind of order the world wished to keep. And as the scales settled and Ra drew breath to speak. The whole divine court leaned forward into the moment that would carry them toward a crown. Ascends, and the first true shape of restored rule. The hall waited so completely that even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Ra stood in the center of the tribunal light, and the scales of Maat hung before him with a stillness more unnerving than motion. One pan held the weight of lawful claim, witness, memory, bloodline, endurance, and the restored balance that had begun to return the moment Horus rose again with the healed silver eye. The other held force, achievement, fear, necessity, and all the hard arguments by which Set had wrapped his long possession of the throne. For a few suspended heartbeats, both sides seemed possible, and I think that was the worst part of it. History is rarely frightening because nothing can happen. It is frightening because too many things still can. Then the scales moved. Not quickly, not with spectacle. The pan that carried Horus sank with a calm authority, like a stone finding the riverbed it had always belonged to. The other rose. A low sound passed through the hall. Some part sigh, some part prayer, some part old tension, finally leaving the body of the world. The stars painted on the ceiling brightened. The eternal flames shifted from the hard white of judgment to a clear gold that filled the chamber with warmth instead of strain. Ra gave the verdict. Horus, son of Isis and Osiris, lawful heir, restorer of balance, keeper of the two lands, was named rightful king. The words rolled out through the hall and beyond it. They crossed the courts, the pylons, the sacred lake, the river, the deserts, and every unseen place where spirits and powers listened for changes in authority. It was not merely an announcement. It was a rearrangement, a straightening of what had long been crooked. Set did not collapse. That would have made the moment too easy. He stood rigid, his strange face sharp with disbelief that was already hardening into resentment. It is always a little pathetic. Honestly, when a usurper discovers that possession and legitimacy are not twins after all. He opened his mouth to challenge the ruling, then closed it again when the flames beside Ra rose higher. Even chaos has enough instinct to recognize when the room has finally turned against it. The judges spoke one by one after Ra, not because the verdict required repetition, but because law becomes stronger when wisdom echoes it from many mouths. Both affirmed the legality of the proceedings, the testimony, the trials, and the signs. Neith declared that Horus had shown not only strength but restraint, which is rarer and more useful. Geb spoke of the land itself, of fields that had leaned toward disorder under Set, and now already seemed to breathe easier. Nut lifted her long starry hands and said the upper paths of heaven had resumed their proper geometry. Even Sobek, never a sentimental witness, admitted that a river obeys a ruler who understands rhythm more readily than one who only understands force. Hathor smiled softly as she spoke of kingship not as appetite, but as care. Ptah said little. Yet when he finally opened his lips, he described Horus as a form properly fitted to purpose, and in that old maker language, there was no higher approval. Nephthys, who had known too much sorrow from too close, bowed her head and acknowledged that the dead had waited long enough. The room listened to her more closely than it had listened to almost anyone. The matter of Set could not be ignored. A throne might be granted, But a defeated god does not simply vanish like smoke after a lamp is covered. The judges considered the old truth that even harsh forces have their place. Desert is cruel, but without its border, the fertile ground has no edge. Storm is violent, but without disturbance, stagnation grows fat and sleepy. So Ra pronounced not annihilation, but limitation. Set would not rule Egypt. He would be given the red lands, the outer places, the border wastes, the hard horizons where danger from beyond must be met by a power not afraid to bare its teeth. Set laughed once when he heard this. A short, dry sound, like gravel poured from a jar. It was not joy. It was the sound of someone discovering he has not been spared, only assigned. Yet he accepted it because he had no clean path left. He would keep power, but not the crown. Keep terror, but not legitimacy. Keep wilderness, but lose the center. In some ways, that is a sharper punishment than simple destruction. To live on outside the warmth, seeing the order you tried to devour continue without you. Horus watched his uncle with an expression almost impossible to read. There was no triumph in it, at least not the easy kind. He had fought too hard and buried too much innocence for easy triumph. What stood in his face was something steadier. Recognition, perhaps. The knowledge that justice does not erase grief. It only prevents grief from becoming the constitution of the world. Once the judgment was complete, the Great Hall changed function. A place of accusation and answer became a place of preparation. Priests, attendants, divine craftsmen, bearers of sacred oils, keepers of regalia, all moved with purposeful quiet. The crown chambers were opened for the first time in many years. Doors of cedar and electrum swung inward on soundless hinges. Cool air flowed out, carrying the scents of old linen, incense dust, lotus balm, metal, and the faint sweetness of ages kept undisturbed. Inside, the regalia of lawful rule waited. The white crown of Upper Egypt gleamed with austere brilliance. The red crown of Lower Egypt curved with its own fierce elegance. Together they would become the sign not merely of territory held, but of division healed. The crook and flail lay crossed upon a stand of black stone. Broad collars shone with inlaid carnelian, lapis, turquoise, and gold. Sandals rested beside them, so finely made they seemed, meant for someone who walked not on ground, but on idea itself. If you were there with me, I think your eyes would drift toward the crown first, but mine would stay with the servants unfolding the linen. Those little careful motions always get me. Civilizations love grand symbols, yet it is often a pair of patient hands, smoothing cloth in lamplight, that makes the grand moment possible. Horus was led to the chamber of purification. His wounds were washed. Water from sacred basins moved over his skin in thin silver sheets. Oils were pressed into old cuts and newer scars. Incense smoke passed around him in rings. The restored lunar eye flashed now and then, with a brightness different from his old sight. And each time it did, the silver bowls nearby answered with small, trembling reflections. Isis remained close through all of it. Not directing, not interrupting, simply present. She had hidden him in reeds, fed him in fear, taught him in mud and moonlight, watched him bleed in the sky and the river, watched him nearly lose one of the lights that made him whole. Now she watched strangers place kingship upon him. That must have felt strange, even to a goddess. To carry a child for so long through danger, only to surrender him at last to ceremony. At one point, Horus turned toward her. He did not speak. Neither did she, but his head inclined just enough, and hers answered. And in that small exchange lay years of marsh silence and maternal labor that no formal hymn could contain. The coronation path had to be walked slowly. That was tradition. The new king passed through 7 thresholds, each marked by guardians, each requiring acknowledgement of one aspect of rule: strength without cruelty, law without rigidity, mercy without weakness, plenty without indulgence, vision without vanity, memory without paralysis, power without theft. At every threshold, Horus paused, received the symbolic token, and stepped onward. The chamber music behind him remained low and steady. Sistrums whispered. Drums sounded like controlled heartbeats. When the crowns were joined and set upon his head, the air in the room shifted. Not metaphorically. Actually, the pressure changed. Light thickened. The falcon current that had moved around him all his life seemed to descend fully and settle. The new eye brightened. The solar eye answered. Gold and silver came into equilibrium across his face. Some of the lesser gods lowered their eyes at once. Others smiled. A few looked suddenly older, as if they had been waiting so long for this that relief itself was a kind of exhaustion. Ra placed the final blessing upon the crown. Thoth recorded the names. Neith touched the crook. Hathor touched the collar. Geb spoke to the floor beneath Horus' feet. Nut bent low enough that a strand of starlight trailed from her body and wrapped briefly around the crown before vanishing. Every gesture deepened the legitimacy of what had been declared. Then Horus was led to the throne. It stood upon a dais reached by shallow steps of polished stone. Falcon wings rose along its sides. Lotus and papyrus twined at its base. Upper and Lower Egypt bound in decorative peace that had once been a political hope and now became cosmic fact again. The seat itself was older than several kingdoms, worn only slightly where prior divine rulers had rested their weight. Horus did not drop into it. He turned first to face the hall. Good rulers understand that sitting is the least important part of enthronement. He raised one hand. The hall quieted so completely that you could hear the drip of water from the purification basin in the next room. His first words as king were not threats to enemies or boasts about victory. He spoke of restoration, of balance, of proper flood, of law clear enough that the weak need not fear it and the strong could not purchase exemptions from it. He spoke of honoring the dead without living inside death forever. He spoke of vigilance at the borders and fairness within them. He spoke, too, of pain, though not in an indulgent way. He said the land had suffered. The gods had suffered. The wound would not disappear because the verdict had been given. But a wound may stop ruling the body even before it fully closes. That line moved through the assembly like a breeze through tall reeds. When at last he sat, the throne accepted him. Strange thing to say. Maybe, but ancient seats do have their opinions. The room felt it. The floor settled. The flames steadied. Outside, over the river, a flock of falcons rose in a dark wheel and then spread eastward into morning. Celebration followed, though in dignified form at first. Offerings were brought. Hymns began. Sacred bread, beer, figs, pomegranates, roasted fowl, and sweet cakes appeared on long tables. Musicians took their places. The women who kept festival perfumes moved through the aisles, leaving lines of myrrh and blue lotus in the air. The whole temple smelled suddenly like relief dressed for a feast. And yet, beneath the joy, there remained a quieter current. Osiris was not back. The years in hiding were not erased. The scar in the eye was still there, even if transfigured. That is why the scene feels true to me. Nothing perfect had happened. Something better had. Order had returned without pretending sorrow was a rumor. As evening descended, the public parts of the ceremony gave way to the more private duties of kingship. Horus visited the chambers where the names of rulers were stored. He stood before images of those who had held lawful power and those who had abused it. He passed through rooms where maps of floodplains, granaries, shrine networks, desert roads, and star tables lay waiting. Kingship, after all, is partly myth, but mostly administration lit by myth. Someone must bless the river, yes, but someone must also know where the grain is. Later still, he returned briefly to the high terrace overlooking the sacred lake. Isis joined him there. Below them, torchlight trembled on the water. Frogs called from the reeds. The scent of night flowers drifted upward. For the first time since the marsh years, perhaps for the first time ever, there was no immediate threat rushing toward them from dark water or dark sky. Horus stood with the crown in his hands rather than on his head. The wind moved softly through the sidelocks and ribbons hanging from it. His restored eye reflected the moon, but not passively. It seemed to examine her, to enter into some cool conversation with her. Isis looked at him and smiled, though only a little. Mothers of great figures rarely get enough rest to become sentimental. She told him the throne was won. Now it must be deserved every day. He answered with a tired half-smile that still, for an instant, looked very much like the child who had once broken a reed cradle merely by stretching. Below, the hymns continued. Beyond, Egypt waited. And the long work of rightful rule, quieter than battle, slower than revenge, but far more difficult, began at last. Morning under Horus did not arrive as a miracle in the childish sense. The sun did not suddenly grow larger. The Nile did not leap out of its bed in applause. Life resumed in the only way real restoration ever happens, with 1,000 small corrections that together amount to grace. The first flood after the coronation came on time. Not wildly, not weakly, just right. The black silt spread in a measured skin across the fields. Farmers standing ankle-deep in the softening edges of their land looked at one another with that cautious expression people wear when they do not yet dare to trust good fortune. The river spirits returned to their channels. Birds nested where they had abandoned their reeds. Fish traveled familiar routes again. Cattle calmed. The wind over the grain no longer carried that faint, nervous irregularity it had learned during Set's long occupation of the center. Even the temple cats, who are severe little judges of atmosphere, stretched more openly in the courtyards and slept with fewer interruptions. You know a kingdom is healing when the cats look less offended by existence. Word of the restored order moved through Egypt in different ways depending on who received it. Priests proclaimed it in sanctuaries. Scribes recorded it in tidy signs. Boatmen carried it from quay to quay. Mothers repeated it while braiding their daughters' hair. Soldiers heard it as a promise that border duty and home defense would now answer to law rather than impulse. The poor heard it as the possibility that grain tallies might be honest again. The old heard it as the return of a rhythm they thought the world had forgotten. Horus ruled not like a flame thrown onto dry reeds, but like irrigation, steady, directed, life-giving because controlled. He listened longer than many expected. He judged more slowly than some preferred. Yet once his decisions were made, they held. The restored lunar eye gave him strange advantages in counsel. He could read tension before words formed. He sensed deception in the way light altered around a speaker. He noticed when practical advice hid private appetite. This made certain courtiers deeply uncomfortable, which, to be fair, is one of the more wholesome effects a ruler can have. He rebuilt what mattered first. Canal systems neglected during years of bad authority were dredged and repaired. Local shrines damaged by political spite or divine neglect received new offerings and proper personnel. Grain storage was reordered. Temple records were checked against actual harvest counts. Military outposts along the Red Lands remained supplied, but no longer licensed to treat every uncertainty as an excuse for brutality. It is less glamorous than the old stories, perhaps, but empires survive on granaries and calendars more often than on roaring. The judges who had watched the trials sometimes came to observe him in quiet moments. Thoth admired the efficiency of his written decrees. Neith appreciated his capacity to distinguish necessary force from theatrical force. Hathor approved whenever justice was shaped so that life afterward remained worth living. Even Ra, who did not hand out praise like festival sweets, began to speak of Horus as one properly fitted to the burdens of center and sky. Set remained in the outer places. There he ruled the desert marches, the storms, the foreign edges, the hard red territories where danger and necessity frequently walk side by side. Some days he delighted in the harshness of it. Some days he hated the distance from the throne with a hatred that dried the air around him. Yet the arrangement held because even his rage now had walls around it. This mattered. Chaos does not need to be erased to save a world. It needs borders. Still, the old conflict never vanished completely. Sandstorms would rise at the frontier with suspicious timing. Caravans occasionally returned with stories of a red shadow on the dunes, or a great beast glimpsed at twilight, where no beast should be. Horus answered not with panic, but with readiness. Garrison reports were improved. Border shrines received stronger protections. Falcon standards flew at desert posts as reminders that order did not fear the horizon simply because the horizon was dry. Over time, the relationship between Horus and Set hardened into a pattern familiar to history. Contest without annihilation. tension without collapse. A terrible uncle kept useful by distance and necessity. Honestly, many families would consider that a very respectable compromise. The eye that had been broken became one of the greatest symbols in all the lands touched by Egyptian memory. Priests copied its form onto amulets, walls, coffins, boats, cradles, and ceremonial tools. Not because it represented untouched perfection, but because it represented restoration after violation. Every part of the eye carried measure: brow, pupil, curve, line, tear mark, falcon stripe, fractions nested inside wholeness. It taught that what is broken may be gathered, that what is gathered may become more than what was first lost. This is one reason symbols endure. They say with shape what people cannot always bear to say aloud. Children wore the eye on cord and bead. Sailors painted it on hulls. Physicians invoked it over wounds. Mourners traced it on shrouds. Kings claimed it on monuments. Mothers pressed it into soft clay beside sleeping infants. The eye traveled through classes and centuries because everyone knows, in one way or another, what it is to hope that damage can be contained, studied, named, and if not erased, then changed into protection. The old story of Osiris also remained, and rightly so. Horus did not restore order by pretending death had not happened. He ruled in conversation with loss. This shaped Egyptian kingship forever. Each living king stood as Horus, bright, watchful, active. Each dead king became Osiris, remembered, transformed, folded into the deep green mystery of what continues after burial and prayer. Rule became a cycle, not a possession. Life, death, inheritance, renewal. The throne did not abolish mortality. It gave mortality a place in the larger pattern. This is why tombs mattered. Why embalming mattered. Why names carved into stone mattered. Why ritual mattered. A civilization learned to imagine continuity not by denying endings, but by framing them inside return. The dead were not simply gone. They moved into another office. The living did not begin from nothing. They received, answered, and carried on. Horus, in his elder aspects, remained a sky god beyond all court drama, vast and original, a falcon spread across the dome of being itself. Horus, in his younger story, remained the hidden child, the prince of reeds and danger, the one raised under threat and sharpened by patience. Horus as king became the bridge between those truths. Cosmic height and practical rulership. Star and grain count. Divine fury and deliberate law. That complexity is part of why he lasted so long in memory. He was never merely one thing. At Edfu, his worship grew rich and exact. Temple walls told the great conflict in carved scenes. Priests in white linen moved through corridors scented with incense and cool stone. Sacred falcons were tended with care, their feathers cleaned, their feeding measured, their mews kept as holy spaces. Festivals reenacted the victory over disorder. Ritual boats crossed ceremonial waters. Crowds gathered under the heat, under banners and music, while priests carried the god in procession through the city. In royal titulary, the Horus name came first, before the rest of the titles, before the long formal strings of divine and earthly designation. The ruler was bound to the falcon. This mattered more than ornament. It declared that legitimate power came with cosmic obligation. A king was not merely strong. He was supposed to see, not merely to see enemies, but seasons, the stars, roads, omens, lies, hunger, and the 1,000 little future problems already beginning in present neglect. When rulers failed in that duty, the old story waited for them. Every usurper was compared in whispers to Set. Every rightful heir was invited to imagine himself as Horus. Every legal restoration, every recovered boundary, every repaired shrine, every healed body participated a little in the same ancient template. Myth is not only about gods long ago. It is a measuring rod hidden in the walls of culture. Greek visitors later called the child Harpocrates and reinterpreted gestures in their own ways. Other empires came. Languages shifted. Dynasties failed. Temples closed. Sand entered everything, as it always does. Yet the falcon remained. On walls, in fragments, in museum hush, in desert light, in symbols copied by hands that no longer fully remembered the original prayers but still felt the shape had power in it. And there is power in it, not because a symbol is magic by itself, but because symbols store disciplined attention. The Eye of Horus stores memory of injury repaired. The falcon stores memory of height joined to precision. The throne stores memory of legitimacy tested, not assumed. The marsh childhood stores memory that future strength can be fed in hiding. The whole story is a warning that family wounds can become national wounds, and a comfort that justice, though often late, does not always fail. I think that is why the tale has endured so stubbornly. It knows something about the human condition that remains embarrassingly current. People still envy, still steal, still justify theft as competence, still hide children from dangerous men, still hope wise judges will see through polished rhetoric, still gather symbols around their wounds, still call leadership good when it protects more than it consumes. Even the battle between order and chaos in this story is more subtle than many later retellings like to admit. Set is not a cartoon villain dropped into the cosmos to make the hero look tidy. He is force without proportion, appetite without moral architecture, necessity swollen into self-excuse. Horus is not innocence preserved in glass. He is innocence broken, trained, corrected, and finally made responsible. That is a stronger thing. By the later centuries, artisans had given the story so many forms that one could walk through Egypt and see it refracted everywhere. In painted coffins, in polished amulets, in temple lintels, in songs recited at dusk, in formulas muttered over medicine, in the design of crowns, in festival games played by children who only half knew why the falcon always won. That is how myth truly rules, not only in grand texts, but in habits. Imagine for a moment a scribe in some quiet chamber by lamplight. The room smells of soot ink, reed pen, drying papyrus. and the faint old odor of stone that has held coolness all day. He copies the story of the eye, the trial, the crown. His hand pauses over a sign. Outside, evening settles over the Nile. Somewhere nearby, a woman hums to a child. Somewhere farther off, a falcon cuts once across the purple band of sunset. The scribe dips his pen again. What he writes will outlast him by centuries. He knows this only vaguely, but he senses it enough to sit straighter. Or imagine a mother knotting a small eye amulet onto a cord for her son's neck. She does not need to lecture him on theology. She just presses the charm once and hopes the world will be a little less cruel, because a symbol of restored wholeness now rests against his skin. Or imagine a king standing alone before dawn on a palace roof, feeling the weight of the Horus name settling on him more heavily than gold. Below him lie fields, kitchens, barracks, shrines, workshops, canals, pregnancies, funerals, border tensions, tax complaints, and all the ordinary, relentless material from which a kingdom is built. Above him, falcons move on air they do not own, but understand. It is a fair image for rule. You never own the sky. You learn to read it. As the old religion dimmed, and later ages laid new beliefs across the stones of Egypt, Horus did not disappear so much as sink into the foundations. Archaeologists would later brush dust from falcon heads, from eye marks, from temple reliefs where kings smote enemies under avian protection. Scholars would puzzle through hymns. Tourists would squint upward at carvings in the heat. Children in schoolbooks would meet the story in simplified form. Yet beneath all those later encounters, the deeper current remained the same. The divine falcon began as the shape of a bird against unbearable brightness, then became a god of sky, then a child hidden in reeds, then an avenger, then a litigant, then a king, then a principle, then a symbol, then a memory that kept generating new memories. Very few figures survived that much transformation without becoming hollow. Horus did not become hollow because every version still held a live center. See clearly. Protect what is entrusted. Answer theft with legitimacy. Let the damaged thing be healed with care, not denial. Keep chaos in its place, but do not pretend it has none. And now, with the fire low, and the room growing softer around us, perhaps that is the gentlest place to leave him. Not frozen in a battle pose, not forever young in the marsh, not only crowned. Better to leave him in the movement between forms, eye bright, wings folded for the moment, a ruler who learned first how to survive, then how to judge, then how to bear what he had won. Outside, the Nile keeps its old conversations with moonlight. Reeds whisper in the dark. Somewhere in that old Egyptian night, a falcon settles onto stone, feathers folding in around the body with quiet precision. The world is not free of danger. It never was. But for one long sacred interval, order has returned to the center. The wound has become a sign of protection, and the sky still holds the memory of wings. Good night.